For 2 years, the crew of Atlantic Airways Flight 447 had been calling flight attendant Jessica just another pretty face, assuming she was hired for looks rather than qualifications. But when both pilots collapsed from food poisoning at 35,000 feet with 300 passengers aboard, Jessica would land the Boeing 777 safely and reveal why she'd been hiding her Navy carrier pilot background. Welcome to Hidden Valor. This story begins aboard Atlantic Airways Flight 447, a Boeing 777-300ER cruising at 37,000 feet somewhere over the North Atlantic. The wide-body aircraft carried 300 passengers and 12 crew members on what should have been a routine 8-hour flight from New York to London. Jessica Angel Torres, 28 years old, had been working as a senior flight attendant for Atlantic Airways for 2 years. With long dark hair, professional demeanor, and the kind of calm efficiency that made her excellent at passenger service, she appeared to be exactly what the flight crew expected from cabin staff. But what Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen didn't know was that Jessica Torres had spent 6 years flying FA-18 Super Hornets off aircraft carriers before leaving the Navy to pursue a normal life, away from the constant pressure of carrier operations. The flight deck crew treated Jessica with the casual dismissiveness that many pilots reserve for cabin staff. Captain Miguel Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with over 15,000 flight hours, viewed flight attendants as passenger service personnel who had no understanding of actual aviation operations. Torres, Captain Rodriguez called during the pre-flight briefing, make sure the passengers understand that turbulence is normal. Last flight, some lady was convinced we were going to crash because of a little chop. Jessica nodded professionally while completing her safety equipment checks. Of course, Captain. I'll handle any passenger concerns about flight conditions. First Officer David Chen, younger but equally dismissive, added his perspective. Jessica, stick to serving drinks and handling complaints. Leave the flying to people who actually know how to operate aircraft. This had been the consistent dynamic for 2 years. Rodriguez and Chen treated Jessica as competent cabin crew, but never considered that she might possess aviation knowledge that exceeded their own experience. The problem with flight attendants, Rodriguez often told other pilots, is that they think working around aircraft makes them understand aviation. Jessica's good at her job, but she's still just service personnel. The truth was that Jessica's transition from Navy carrier pilot to commercial flight attendant had been motivated by a desire to remain close to aviation while avoiding the high-stress environment that had defined her military career. Flying off aircraft carriers required skills that exceeded anything commercial pilots experienced, but she had chosen to keep that background private. The crisis began 3 hours into the flight when both pilots became violently ill from contaminated seafood they had eaten during their London layover. The symptoms started gradually with mild nausea, but escalated rapidly into severe food poisoning that left both men incapacitated and unable to continue flight operations. "Jessica," Rodriguez called weakly over the intercom, his voice showing obvious distress. "I need you in the cockpit immediately. We have a serious medical emergency up here." Jessica entered the flight deck to find both pilots showing signs of severe illness. Rodriguez was barely conscious, slumped in his seat and struggling to maintain awareness, while Chen was completely incapacitated, and neither man was capable of operating the aircraft safely. "Captain, what's your condition?" Jessica asked, immediately assessing the situation with calm professionalism that surprised Rodriguez, despite his weakened state and growing confusion. "Food poisoning," Rodriguez managed between waves of nausea. "Both of us got it bad. Can't fly anymore. Need to declare emergency and request immediate diversion to nearest suitable airport." Jessica looked at the aircraft instruments, automatically reading the navigation displays, engine parameters, and flight management systems with familiarity that would have shocked the pilots if they had been alert enough to notice her competent scan of the complex systems. "Sir, our position is 400 miles from the nearest suitable runway. Given your condition and the passenger count, I recommend we continue toward our original destination rather than attempt an emergency landing at a smaller facility." Rodriguez stared at her with confusion. "Jessica, how do you know our position? How do you know about runway suitability?" "Captain, with respect, we need to focus on immediate priorities. You're both too ill to continue flight operations, and we have 300 passengers who need to reach the ground safely." Chen, barely conscious, managed to ask the question that would change everything. Jessica, can you actually fly this aircraft? Jessica looked at the two incapacitated pilots, then at the Boeing 777's complex flight deck with its multiple displays, automated systems, and sophisticated avionics. To most people, the cockpit would have been incomprehensible. To Jessica, it was familiar territory. Yes, I can fly this aircraft. Rodriguez struggled to focus despite his illness. Jessica, this isn't a simulator. This is a Boeing 777 with 300 people aboard. Commercial aircraft require specific training and certification. Captain, I understand the complexity of the situation, but right now I'm the most qualified person available to get everyone home safely. What Rodriguez and Chen didn't understand was that Jessica's carrier aviation background had prepared her for exactly this kind of emergency. Landing an FA-18 on a moving aircraft carrier in rough seas required precision and skill that exceeded anything needed for commercial aviation. She had executed over 200 carrier landings during her Navy career, including night operations and emergency recoveries that tested pilots beyond normal limits. Jessica took the captain's seat and began familiarizing herself with the Boeing 777 specific systems. While the aircraft was much larger than the fighters she had flown, the basic principles of aviation remained the same, and her military training had emphasized adaptability and quick learning under pressure. The commercial aircraft's automated systems actually made many procedures easier than the manual flying she had mastered in tactical aircraft. Air traffic control, this is Atlantic 447, Jessica transmitted with calm professionalism that reflected years of radio discipline learned in high-stress military operations. We have a medical emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated. Flight attendant with aviation background has assumed control of aircraft. The response from London Control came immediately. Atlantic 447, understand both pilots incapacitated. What is the aviation background of person now controlling aircraft? Jessica hesitated briefly before responding. London Control, I'm a former Navy carrier pilot with 2,000 flight hours in tactical aircraft. I can safely operate this Boeing 777. The radio silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds before London Control responded. Atlantic 447, did you say former Navy carrier pilot? Affirmative. I have experience with high-performance aircraft operations and emergency procedures. What followed was the most challenging flight of Jessica's aviation career. With guidance from air traffic control and consultation with Boeing technical specialists via radio, she managed the complex systems of the wide-body aircraft while maintaining safe flight operations for 3 hours. The approach to London Heathrow required her to demonstrate skills that commercial pilots rarely needed. Carrier landings had taught her precision approaches in challenging conditions, and the Boeing 777's automated systems actually made the process easier than the manual flying she had mastered in the Navy. Atlantic 447, you are cleared for approach runway 27R. Weather is favorable with light winds. Jessica configured the aircraft for landing, managing flaps, landing gear, and approach speed with the systematic precision that had made her successful as a carrier pilot. The passengers remained unaware that their flight attendant was now flying the aircraft, having been told only that there was a minor medical situation in the cockpit. The landing was perfect. Jessica touched down on centerline with minimal vertical speed and executed a smooth rollout that would have impressed any commercial pilot. The 300 passengers applauded what they assumed was excellent flying by their regular crew. When the aircraft reached the gate, emergency medical personnel were waiting for Rodriguez and Chen, who were transported to a London hospital for treatment. Jessica remained in the cockpit, completing post-flight procedures with the same attention to detail she had learned in the Navy. Captain Sarah Williams, Atlantic Airways chief pilot, boarded the aircraft to debrief the emergency. Her expression showed amazement as she reviewed Jessica's handling of the situation. Torres, what you accomplished today should have been impossible. How does a flight attendant successfully operate a Boeing 777 for 3 hours and execute a perfect landing? Jessica removed her flight attendant jacket, revealing the small Navy wings pin she always wore but kept hidden. Ma'am, I'm a former Navy carrier pilot. I flew FA-18S for 6 years before transitioning to civilian life. Captain Williams stared at the pin, beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. Jessica, you're telling me we've had a carrier-qualified pilot working as cabin crew for 2 years? Yes, ma'am. I left the Navy because I wanted a normal life, but I stayed in aviation because I love flying. Williams studied the flight data recorder information that documented Jessica's performance. Your flying was textbook perfect. Emergency procedures, systems management, approach and landing. Everything was executed at commercial airline standards. Ma'am, carrier operations taught me to handle emergency situations calmly and systematically. Today just required applying those skills to a different aircraft. 6 months later, Jessica Torres was hired as a first officer for Atlantic Airways after completing accelerated commercial pilot training. Her emergency landing became a case study in aviation training programs, demonstrating how military aviation skills could transfer to commercial operations. Captain Rodriguez, after recovering from his illness, became one of Jessica's strongest advocates. I spent 2 years treating her like she was just cabin crew, he told other pilots. Turns out she was more qualified than most of us to handle that emergency. Jessica often reflected on her 2 years of being dismissed as just a flight attendant, while carrying qualifications that exceeded those of the pilots who looked down on her. She had learned that expertise often goes unrecognized when it doesn't fit people's expectations. Sometimes the most qualified person in the room is the one everyone assumes knows the least. And sometimes the flight attendant serving your coffee is actually the pilot who could land your aircraft when no one else can. If this story inspired you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that expertise comes in unexpected forms and that the most capable people are often the ones whose backgrounds we never bother to learn about.